Well, here we are after another successful year of riding coasters, ending in 2025 with 76 roller coasters in 7 states. Now, I know this may feel weird as of posting this, that nothing really came out for 2025 in terms of my experiences, and not all for 2024 was released. So I'll give a brief synopsis of what occurred in 2025. Now, for me, 2025 would be the most ambitious year for coasters yet in many aspects. From statistical monsters to parks visited to states experienced to thrill rides that felt like no other. Really, I got a nice variety of coasters that really wowed me this year, where I felt like I have to really choose my favorites over relying on default coasters placements, like what happened in 2024 and 2023. Now, yes, this is likely not as much as other enthusiasts may have, but this is still a precious collection that I've mostly enjoyed. And to not only celebrate this year, but to also update the viewers on what I've done, this is my top 30 roller coasters as of December 14th, 2025. Now, the rules before we begin the list. For one, this is an opportunity to not fully reflective for 2025, given that there could be a possible park or two squeezed in before the year ends. I've also intended this to release on the list on December 24th, 2025, in order to line up the list before I release my cameo video on Christmas Day. As as of the recording, I have gotten the video on the 2 days ago, so there you go. And given that December 24th to January 5th has the potential for a lot to happen in my coaster life, I'm going to cap the list here. Uh, don't worry, there probably is going to be more coming though next year. Second notice is that this list is subjective, in which the preferences for one ride to the next is all dependent on my tastes. In which I have a preference for rides that structure in many different types of maneuvers and forces, while keeping up the frequency of the forces for a long time. The forces don't necessarily have to be the strongest and craziest, but can help make specific moments have a more lasting impact for me, although not necessarily carrying an entire ride. I'll also elaborate on structure, as in what it is more so like instead of just going from element to element, it's more so building upon each other. It has like each element correlates to the next. So let's say there's like the first half is kind of intense, but not really. And then the second half, and then it keeps on building and building. Uh, Maybe Velocicoaster's similar to that, but I haven't ridden it. But that's probably the best example. I also don't have much of an issue for roughness, as long as the ride isn't forceless. Looking at Roar specifically in this case as a rough ride that I don't like. Finally, before going on to the list, I would mention that some coasters that might have made the list, but for whatever reason, I missed them during my visits for these places. I'll place a timestamp on the screen right now if you want to skip to the number 30th spot. So first off would be the top three roller coasters at Islands Adventure. So it's Hagrid's Incredible Hulk and the aforementioned Velocicoaster. These three roller coasters I pretty much chickened out on, which was pretty sad given I would have likely loved these creations. Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure felt would probably feel like a ride that would have placed in a decent spot in my top 20, given that I love long rides with a lot of coaster action, even if the ride is family friendly. Then the Incredible Hulk seems to be a B&M at its best, with some of the best forces and pacing I've seen from the rides, while holding a familiar force types as well for compared to other B&Ms. I would have anticipated this ranking at the number 5 spot if I rode this. Then Velocicoaster would have easily taken number 1 with the pacing, various forces, and the build up from the solid start to an epic finish. Next up we have Defiance at Glenwood Caverns. Was a ride that I also chickened out on, but overall seems to be a solid looper with various amount of forces. Although quite short in length. This could have placed in 27th on the list. Then talking about closed coasters that I've missed, that could have made it on here. Superman Ride of Steel and Batwing at Six Flags America had really good chances to do so. Superman seemed like a nice hyper with a mix of forces and great sense of speed, for a long time while not the most perfect in pacing. That could have probably not placed in my top 10. But Batwing, on the other hand, seems to actually hold a potential that a flying coaster could hold for me in terms of force type and different feelings of these maneuvers compared to a B&M. Uh, Unfortunately, though, we cannot experience these two anymore, which is a shame given that these would have been the best rides at Six Flags America, or at the very least, the most unique. Then the big prize that I've missed out on was Pantherian at King's Dominion. Yay. Now, I'll talk about the story of Pantherian when we get into the more in-depth videos or analysis of my experiences, which is not this video. But for now, I'll just say that I missed out on this excellently placed and forceful coaster because Pantherian had lift issues, let's just say.
One
Final
night
two
is
coasters I'll mention are under construction products with Fast and Furious Hollywood Drift that likely will have a pretty nice forces and decent pacing, plus a nice quantity of elements that really doesn't make the ride feel too short, but at the same time doesn't really feel like too long. I don't expect Fast and Furious to really be a number one roller coaster for me. But I do expect it to have some nice forces. And then as well, Twin Mill Racers at Matilda Adventure Park. That also has a nice variety of forces. It seems like it has nice airtime positives and maybe some laterals that could also apply to the previous one and maybe hang time. And elements that are modest in size for the layout. Although not too big, given this is a kind of a modified loop screw layout, so it's not the biggest, but as well. Like those are not really too big, but it's a little more at least. I'm likely to experience these when these both open to the public, but so far these haven't opened yet. So I guess it's a we'll see thing. Anyways, with all this out of the way, I'll now start the coaster summary, starting with Full Throttle at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Now, in terms of ride experience, this coaster is an excellent option for individual elements, with all the elements holding a punch of its own. From the first launch feeling decently forceful, with the high speed and constant acceleration, to the large vertical loop having many seconds of sustained hang time, to the trick that's hidden away from the plaza, to the final drop being the most forceful drop that I've done so far, at least for airtime. It's really a cool ride that feels pretty unique in many ways, but for some reason, there's something that kind of itches my head, something that feels off. And for that answer, I'll note one main thing, that being the pacing of the coaster, where the coaster feels pretty short and incomplete compared to other rides. Just having an awesome start and an awesome end, and the track that really just loops around the mountain in order to connect to the loop and drop together. I really would wish that the more track was existent after the loop and trick doing more, given that a middle section would feel like more build up towards an epic finale. Having more to do instead of having a novelty for a large loop connecting a drop to the structure. It ranks this high though, given for the amazing forces and moments during the ride, but severely lacks in the build-up needed to really feel elite, thus making number 30 on this list. Now, following up that would be a coaster that I haven't ridden in a long time, but yet would enjoy still after 2 years. Mineshaft coaster would be an alpine coaster that would utilize the hillside for supports and layout. And to my shock, the coaster would feel quite eventful during the descent. Well, yes, after each lift hill, the coaster would start up slow. The ride quickly gains speed, where many different variations of laterals are conveyed. From more sustained helixes and large drops, the quicker pops on the S-bends and smaller turns, to even airtime on the drops, the ride holds a nice platter of elements while on a long coaster experience. It holds its speed decently well. Well, yes, alpine coasters are naturally not going to be as varied as their true coaster counterparts. At the very least, Mineshaft Coaster didn't feel derivative in a rare California coaster in California, focusing on laterals. Although a more notable issue that I would be that there are a few moments where track doesn't really do anything, where the coaster has some long straight sections, in which there are a few times where they are present during the layout. In return, these straight sections are interruptive of the fun pacing presented. Thankfully, the ride length is long enough to really not have much an issue. It kind of detracts the full potential of the ride that could be. Regardless, I would say that the most Eastern California coaster is pretty underrated, and not a bad option for the $20 price tag. And another expensive coaster is up next. So now we hit our one of many controversial takes that I have, which includes the one and only Big Apple coaster. Now for this creation, there's no better feeling to describe the ride as bizarre. Throughout the experience, the rider would notice a lot of things, some of which are inconsistent and mixed. An easy one to pinpoint is the smooth consistency, as generally the Big Apple feels pretty smooth and real hugging, no shaking side to side or really anything, and even some turns that flow kind of decently. But others have really bizarre profile that has constant jolts on what should be a simple airtime hill. Like this hill, for example, has like at what 4, 5, 6 jolts. But more importantly, the forces feel weird as well, where the first half feels completely different than the second. With the first force focusing on these larger drops that sometimes decide to have random bursts of positives. And then the second half having more smaller hills and turns that's more akin to a family coaster. Additionally, many types of sequencing for the elements exist for the coaster. Some you'll get run-of-the-mill pops of forces like weak pops on the little bunny hills, or sustained positives on the helixes. Then more questionable elements exist, but still not too bizarre, like the dial loop having a second of hang time transition to burst of sustained positives, or that vertical loop having no positives. Then there are things like the first two drops and hills that make me question the thought process behind the design. Having valleys that are pretty forceful, while having most of the sense feeling really drawn out and shallow. Except the weirdest drop being this large one, where in the back only the steepest part of the drop offers a sustained floater for getting slammed in your seat. Like, this coaster is very weird and unconventional with the profiling and elements, but just amazes me for how fun and unique the ride is. From the punchy elements that come out of nowhere, like the large drop or the dive loop, to the variety of forces. In fact, this pretty much holds some of the most variety out of any coaster that I've done, as in you get a taste of a lot of stuff. And paired with the long ride experience, plus the exposing lap bars from Premiere, this should have been in my top 10, you know. Given that I really love these type of rides. But if it wasn't for one thing that I haven't mentioned yet. So if you don't know, I haven't brought up the mid-course brake run yet, in which for this coaster, it slows the train to a crawl. Now, for some coasters, this may be an interruption, but at least it doesn't take too long to clear. That is not what happens with the Big Apple coaster, in which over 10 seconds for the mid-course and turn itself, and then the next hill, which is back to back, in fact, has 7 seconds of being very slow, forceless, and just crawling over. Not only these moments are forceless, like with the other shallow moments of track, but the moments feel slower in comparison to the first part that feels quite speedy. In which I was kind of generous of giving pass to those higher the off the ground moments in the first half due to the abrupt forces in the valley from speed, but alas, the pacing is also wonky for this ride as well. So unfortunately, this will have to stay at 28. But you know, I find the Big Apple so amusing that an individual review going more in depth is actually going to be really fun. But for now, if you, my idea is if you like weird coasters, then I highly recommend trying this at least once, even if it is expensive and even it is a bit remote. Probably the most memorable for Vegas, but I wouldn't say it would be my favorite. But you know that honor kind of goes to the next coaster with El Loco the Adventure Dome. So while Big Apple is a long but somewhat meandering ride, El Loco would be a compact short coaster that has forceful elements with not much brakes, at least compared to the Big Apple. For those unaware, El Loco would be essentially a mix of the Gerstlauer Eurofighter and a Wild Mouse that's unshookified in which much of the elements would have extreme moments of force presented during the layout, from the unbanked hairpin turn with very forceful lateral sustained to ejector airtime pops on the first drop and the ascent up into the straight brake run. Due to dive loops having really sustained hang time more so than the Big Apple coaster above. Then nice positives after the first dive loop, which is pretty nice, along with lateral moments during the turns that turn the rider in the other direction, plus a pop of air. Wait, I already said that. In terms of pacing, the coaster is mostly frequent in this case, given that most elements are entertaining you in one way or another, although not perfect. My main gripes of the pacing really would be the for a final wave turn, which really doesn't do anything to me for me after the dive loop, where no forces are presented after the hang time portion. It's some of the mid-course break runs. This is in consideration that the layout feels quite short, so the forceless track will feel more noticeable in comparison to something like Mineshaft Coaster. I'll still give El Loco the edge for having a nice variety of really strong forces, but the pacing and length is somewhat something that I pretty much am in favor of. This is also somewhat related to my surprise for my number 26, in which that is Adrenaline Peak at Oaks Amusement Park. The Ghost Warrior fighter up in Oregon, basically. Now, while the forces for this are more mild in comparison, I would say that the coaster has less lulls in the pacing compared to El Loco, while not sacrificing the different types of forces, and unfortunately keeps a similar short duration. To start naming some highlights, I really like the first drop offering nice ejector airtime in the back. The vertical loop had a nice mix of hang time and positives, although pretty mild for a thrill coaster. The cutback was pretty meh, where positive forces are only present. The Heartland roll was pretty nice, having decent hang time sustained, and surprisingly deceiving slope up that gives a nice burst of positives and airtime. The main thing that I prefer out of Adrenaline Peak, though, is that the flow more seamlessly compared to El Loco, and is pretty much the main reason it's one spot higher. Adrenaline Peak is still short as hell, though, and pretty much the last words I'll say until the review. So yeah. Next up is starting off with our top 25 would be Scream at Magic Mountain as well. The first off, the of all B&M loopers that I've been on. And personally, I would say this feels like the weakest out of all, excluding Firebird, which isn't on this list. Not to say this is a bad ride, but this is still a fun coaster with fluid pacing of other B&M inversions. But something feels off of this one as well. Because with the comparison to other loopers that I've done, Scream feels quite mild and stereotypical in elements. At least with the other B&Ms out there, more unique elements, unique pacing, and more forceful elements are present. Scream pretty much has meh inversions, mixed with a helix that has nice positives, as a combination of float and laterals on the 0G roll, and then the rest being meandering track. I would personally think the layout could do better with more exposed trains, like with stand-up trains. But that's likely never going to happen, so in preference, it's likely that I may use this as an introduction to multi-inversions for people who aren't familiar with those. Those people that don't really, aren't familiar with inversions, but they kind of got over with, their first inversion and stuff. But otherwise, would have preference for the other B&Ms in the state, really. Which we'll get to those soon, but right now, let's, talk another set of controversial takes. So if you don't know, I haven't had an issue with roughness being the sole contributing factor for coasters that I've not enjoyed. Well, let me say this. Sure, there are rides that I don't like that are also rough, but the lack of formal G-force would be more of an issue. Roughness with forceful elements aren't going to really be too much of a problem. This kind of results in rides like Tidal Twister, Big Apple, and Mind Eraser being really fun rides. Well, yes, the Soul Coaster in Colorado being Mind Eraser for a top 30 is a weird phenomenon. I won't deny this being a fun coaster mainly for the forceful inversions and the fluid pacing of the elements. The vertical inversions in the front offers nice entries of punchy positives, sustained until reaching the tops of their respective inversion. But the inline twists offer a sudden entrance for each, And then the moment itself holds nice sustained laterals towards the front of the train. I'll say my favorite type of inversions are the ones that with the abrupt entrances towards really forceful forces sustained. Then the coast constant speed variation with really flowy elements, plus the lack of slowing down much keeps a consistent pace that naturally flows together despite being an older coaster. Both of these aforementioned pacing and forces is why the layout is so fun. I'll say that the layout isn't the longest, with seamless pacing and a limited amount of elements. The ride does feel slightly short of what it could be. Not saying it's something like Adrenaline Peak in length, but given the multi-loopers we are spoiled with in length a lot of times, specifically from B&M, the Vekoma SLC is shorter in comparison. It's also worth noting the comfort. I would say that I didn't get headbanging given most of my head surpassed the head padding. I wouldn't deny that the coaster was consistently shaky and rough. So be warned about this specific coaster in the next one, which is a clone. And number 23. Given that I already talked about what I liked about the SLC layout, I'll instead point out the differences of why I preferred Professor Screamer Skywinder a little bit more, although not by much. The main thing was that, unlike Mind Eraser, where I had no idea what would happen, I had a better time enjoying the layout after sitting on my thoughts for the aforementioned Mind Eraser. Not only that, I experienced the identical forces subsection, but I also realized there was more positives in sections like the first drops valley or the 270-degree turnaround. I'll say that there definitely was less comfortable moments than Mind Eraser, given it was a little less shaky. There's more awful potholes and moments in terms of tracking. I wouldn't say it was a turnoff for my enjoyment, but it was closer to doing in that compared to any other coaster that's not in my bottom 20 or something, or rides that don't have much redeeming. In which I kind of thank the newer Vesta strengths for making the ride likely more comfortable in comparison to what could have been with the over-the-shoulder strengths. That said, I do theorize that the Vest do dampen some of the laterals compared to laterals on like the traditional over-the-shoulder strengths, given that I felt a lack of lateral bracing for the double inline twists on this version compared to what Mind Racer had. Well, while I would say that this is a bit more flawed, I think I enjoyed this variant more. Hence why I get a higher ranking. Also, the color palette is cool as fuck. And now we talk about the B&M at my home park. Woohoo! Emperor at Seaworld San Diego, though it's not really something that I would overlook here. Well, yes, Emperor probably has the shortest and least amount of elements out of the B&Ms I've done. It does make up for the lack of quantity with the quality of the pacing being some of my favorite out of any B&M I've done. I dare say that there's no dead spot for Emperor, really. The first drop, I finally experienced the sustained floater airtime in the back row, followed with forceful positive forces sustained throughout the first Indelman. All of the valleys are pretty forceful with positives, although most are less sustained than the first drop, though. Then the ride kind of mixes up with the elements of holding a few floaty arrow banked turn. A zero-G winder that either nice whip on the edge seats or floatiness in the center. This corkscrew had floatiness on the left wing as well as in the back, which it was pretty cool to see. Even the final turn had forceful positives. Really, the excellent pacing paired with the very forces is why it ranks so high. But the minimal elements is what makes Emperor so low. Tangential thing to also mention, because modern B&M is rough, at least considered by many people. I would say there is a small vibration in back edge sheet, but I wouldn't say it was any too big of an issue. Unless your expectations is a glass smooth ride, not much is really happening. Anyways, moving on. Number 21 is Hang Time at Knott's Berry Farm, which would be a solid multi-looper as well, with a few differences. Hang Time would have the usual positive bursts in the valleys of inversions that were quite solid, but also would have some airtime moments as well. A lot of these valleys include like with there's the corkscrew, the cutback, the uh zero negative G style like cobra. Well, no matter what, you're gonna get like positives in the valleys and not much else though. The first drop all is like for airtime as well in the back is pretty good. I really like that in the final speed hill, giving nice pops of ejector airtime. The main thing about this ride that works is pretty much the pacing that being pretty consistent as well. Having not much interruption in pacing occurs with a fluid layout. Granted, it may not be as flowy as Emperor or something, but it feels somewhat longer in comparison. Emperor kind of has like a few moments at the very least. This kind of makes a couple laps in some way, feeling slightly longer. Unfortunately, though, it is still short as compared to other loopers, uh, especially in the state of California. So, going to knock a point against that. The forces aren't as sustained as other loopers though, but there is a little variety here. So, it kind of stands out. Not really. Um, yeah.